what is your procrastination story? Well, normally when I work with clients, we'd use lots of different techniques to kind of get to the underlying, I suppose, issue or the underlying story that we're telling ourselves that's causing them to procrastinate. Luckily enough, two scientists in the late 90s and early 2000s called Linda Sapinen and Jack McGuire, they wrote a book called The Six Styles of Procrastination and How to Overcome Them. And in that book, they describe 6 stories that are very much related to procrastination and explain why we procrastinate. So the first 3 of these stories, they're linked to a particular emotion. And that emotion is anxiety, or a little bit of underlying fear. So the first story linked with anxiety is, if I try, then I'll fail. And so we tend to procrastinate when we tell ourselves this story, because what's the point in starting something if we're not going to be able to complete it, if we're not going to be able to do it? The second story we often tell ourselves when we procrastinate is, unless it's perfect, I'm a failure. This is also known as perfectionism. And the reason we procrastinate when we tell ourselves this story is that, well, one, when you want to make something perfect, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of resources, and so it's difficult to do. But secondly, we tend to procrastinate because it can be very difficult to make things perfect. And unless it's perfect, then I'm a failure, it's not done, so there's no point in starting in the first place. The third story linked to anxiety that we tend to tell ourselves when we procrastinate is, if I don't accomplish all of this, then I'm a failure. This is what Sapinen and McGuire call the overdoer. So what this is someone who can't say no. And so they take on too many tasks, they take on too many things. And as a result of taking on too many things, what they do is they're not able to prioritize them. And because they don't prioritize them, they don't get the important things done. So that's the overdoer. The next 3 stories linked to procrastination are much more linked to the emotions of boredom and frustration. So the first of these is, I perform better under pressure. And this, we tell ourselves this story when we leave things until the last minute, you know. And I suppose the feeling here is that, you know, you need that little bit of excitement or that little bit of stress in order to motivate you. And the issue with this is, if you compare your performance to when you give yourself enough time as to when you leave things until the last minute, invariably your performance is better when you give yourself enough time. And usually this is because things can go wrong at the last minute. And so if you don't give yourself enough space, you can't correct those mistakes. The fifth story we often tell ourselves, and anytime I read this, I always think of it in a very whingy voice, but it's, I shouldn't have to do it. This is a story we often tell ourselves when we get a task from an external source. So for example, maybe your boss is giving you something that you think is either beneath you or there's no point in doing it and it's a bit stupid. And so as a result, you put it off. The issue with this is generally that when we get these tasks from these external sources, sooner or later, we're going to have to do them. And so by, dragging them out and leaving them for as long as possible, and sometimes not getting them done properly, we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot a little bit. The final story that we often tell ourselves in terms of procrastination, again, very much linked to boredom and frustration, is I shouldn't have to work hard to fulfill my dreams. This is what Sapinen and McGuire called the dreamer. And I suppose the issue with what the dreamer is thinking is that if you ask anyone who's ever kind of achieved anything of note or done anything great, really, generally they have had to work very hard to fulfill their dreams. So I suppose it's maybe not the most realistic story. So the first thing we can do is we can take that story that we've identified and challenge the story. Yeah. So the story I was telling myself is, if I try, then I'll fail. So what do I do about that? Well, I use a method when I'm working with clients called Socratic Questioning. So if you want to give it a Google at some point, Socratic Questioning is just a series of questions that you can ask yourself around any belief, around any story, to test how realistic it is and to test how useful it is. Yeah. So I'm going to get you guys to do a little bit of reflection on this and see if you can challenge your story a little bit. So I'm going to get you to ask yourself some questions around your story. So the first question I'm going to get you to ask yourself is it a realistic story? And why it might be a realistic story and why it mightn't be a realistic story. So I'm going to talk through this, but you can be working away on your own if you find it useful. So when I ask myself this story, or when I ask myself if I try, then I'll fail is a realistic story, I had to say partly that yes, it was partly a realistic story. And the reason it was a realistic story is I tried in the past a few times to, I suppose, get a weightlifting habit going. And I suppose I'd failed in the past. I suppose my routine wasn't solid enough, and I wasn't really watching my diet. So I ended up getting too sore and stopping. So when I asked myself, is it a realistic story? Why might it not be a realistic story? And I looked for a little bit of evidence on the other side of it. And it was more so that, well, actually, do you know what? Conditions are a little bit different now. So I've got a little bit more control over my time. I'm a little bit in better shape in terms of my cardio and stuff like that. So maybe it mightn't hurt so much. So maybe it's not entirely a realistic story either, that if I tried and I'll fail. And so the next question I want you to ask yourself around your story is, what might be a more realistic story? So even if it's partly realistic, what might be a more realistic story? And so what I came up with in terms of my story around weightlifting was, well, if I try, then I might fail, but I might also succeed because conditions are a little bit different now. I have a little bit more time. I'm a little bit in better shape. So the first set of questions I want to ask yourself around your story is it a realistic story? Why not? And what might be a more realistic story? Okay, so the next question I'd like you to ask yourself is it a helpful story? Is the story you're telling yourself around your procrastination, is it helpful? And by helpful, I mean, is it helping you move towards your goals? Is it helping you take action? Is it a story that's helping you get where you want to go? And so when I asked myself, is it a helpful story? If I tried and I failed, then I had to say no, because it was meaning I was avoiding doing it. It was causing me to procrastinate. And so the next question you might ask yourself then is, what might be a more helpful story? So I suppose this is around the lines of, what should I be thinking? What should I be doing? So the story that I come up with when I've done a bit of reflection on this is that, well, if I try, I might fail, but I also might succeed. So if I succeed, great. But if I fail, then what I'll do is I'll try and learn something. So the next time I try, it'll be easier and better. And this is what kind of got me starting to lift weights a couple of weeks ago.